I'm Emma Matthews, 34, and until 3 weeks ago, my family believed I was the pathetic spinster destined for cats and loneliness at Mom's 55th birthday party. My sister Charlotte sneered across the dining room, "Face it, Emma, you'll die alone. No man wants a boring accountant who can't even afford designer clothes." The entire family laughed as I sat there in my Target dress, watching my golden child sister flaunt her latest luxury handbag. What they didn't know was that I'd been secretly dating Alexander Blackwood for 6 months. Yes, the Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, worth $3.2 billion. He'd been traveling for business, but tonight he was flying back early to meet my family. In exactly 20 minutes, he'd walk through that door with a 5-carat engagement ring. And everything would change. Like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. As I sat there in my simple Target dress, Charlotte's words echoing in my mind, memories flooded back like a dam bursting. This wasn't the first time she'd predicted my lonely future. And it certainly wasn't the first time my family had laughed at my expense. Growing up, Charlotte was always the golden child. She was 2 years older, blessed with naturally blonde hair that caught the light just right, and a personality that commanded attention the moment she walked into a room. I was the quiet one, the bookworm, the daughter who got straight A's but somehow never earned the same pride from our parents. I remember my high school graduation vividly. I was valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, and had been accepted into their prestigious accounting program. Mom had barely looked up from her phone when I showed her the acceptance letter. "That's nice, honey," she'd said absently. "Charlotte, tell Emma about your date with that boy from the country club." Charlotte's achievements were always social ones: dating the right boys, getting invited to the right parties, wearing the right clothes. When she made homecoming court junior year, Dad took the day off work to buy her flowers. When I won the state math competition, he asked me to keep it down because he was watching the game. The pattern continued through college. Charlotte chose a small liberal arts school known more for networking than academics, studying communications with a minor in socializing. She called home constantly, regaling Mom and Dad with stories of sorority life and weekend parties. Meanwhile, I buried myself in financial statements and tax codes, graduating summa cum laude while working part-time jobs to cover expenses my scholarship didn't include. "Emma's so serious," Mom would tell her friends. "She never has any fun. We worry about her." But they never worried enough to actually ask me how I was doing, or whether I was happy, or if I needed anything. Charlotte's credit card bills, on the other hand, were always a family emergency requiring immediate attention and financial rescue. When Charlotte announced her engagement to Marcus 5 years ago, you'd have thought she'd won the lottery. The wedding planning consumed our family for an entire year. I was expected to help with everything: addressing invitations, organizing the bridal shower, even contributing financially when unexpected expenses rose. But I wasn't asked to be a bridesmaid. Charlotte had chosen her sorority sisters instead. "Emma wouldn't fit in with the aesthetic I'm going for," she'd explained to Mom, right in front of me. "She's just not polished enough." Mom had nodded sympathetically, as if this was a reasonable concern. I'd stood there, holding samples for table linens I'd been sent to pick up, watching my own mother agree that I wasn't good enough to stand beside my sister on her wedding day. The wedding itself was a production that cost more than my annual salary. Dad proudly walked Charlotte down the aisle while I sat in the third row, behind family friends I barely knew. During the reception, I watched from my corner table as everyone celebrated the perfect daughter's perfect day. That night, going through the photos on social media, I realized something that cut deeper than any of Charlotte's cruel comments. I wasn't in a single professional wedding photo. Not one. It was as if I didn't exist in this milestone moment of my family's life. Yet here I was again, 3 years later, having organized and largely paid for Mom's entire birthday celebration while Charlotte swooped in to take credit and throw insults. The centerpiece I'd special ordered, the catering I'd arranged, the decorations I'd spent my Saturday morning setting up, all invisible contributions to another family event where I was treated as an afterthought. But tonight would be different. Tonight, everything would change. 6 months ago, I never could have imagined my life would take such a dramatic turn. It started, of all places, in a coffee shop. I was having the day from hell. A major client had questioned my audit findings. My car was making strange noises, and I'd spilled coffee on my favorite blouse during my lunch break. I ducked in to grind coffee on LaSalle Street to grab a replacement caffeine fix before my afternoon. In meetings when I literally ran into him, I was rushing, head down, focused on my phone when I collided with someone carrying 2 cups of coffee. The collision sent hot liquid flying, drenching both of us. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," I gasped. Looking up into the most striking gray eyes I'd ever seen, the man was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and the kind of presence that made the busy coffee shop seem to quiet around him. "No harm done," he said. His voice warmed despite being covered in coffee. "Though I think we both need new shirts." I was mortified. This stranger was clearly important. His suit alone probably cost more than I made in a month, and there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of success and confidence. Meanwhile, I was already wearing a stained blouse, and had just made everything worse. Double quotes, "Please, let me pay for dry cleaning," I insisted, fumbling for my wallet. "This is entirely my fault," he laughed, a genuine sound that made something flutter in my chest. "I have a better idea, let me buy you a new coffee, and we'll call it even." I was actually waiting for a meeting that just got cancelled anyway. That's how I found myself sitting across from Alexander Blackwood, though I didn't know his name yet, in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. Both of us slightly damp, and laughing about the absurdity of the situation. "I'm Alex," he said, extending his hand. "Emma," I replied, struck by how he looked directly at me when we shook hands, like he was actually seeing me. The conversation flowed effortlessly. He asked about my work, and when I mentioned I was a CPA, he didn't get that glazed look most people wore when I talked about numbers. Instead, he leaned forward with genuine interest. "That must be incredibly satisfying," he said, making sense of chaos. "Finding patterns others miss. It's like being a detective, isn't it?" I was stunned. No one had ever described my work that way. Certainly not anyone who'd made it sound interesting or valuable. "Yes," I said slowly. "That's exactly what it's like." We talked for 2 hours. He was intelligent, funny, and surprisingly down-to-earth despite the obvious wealth his appearance suggested. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to my answers. When I mentioned my love for hiking, he didn't look surprised. That someone who worked with numbers also enjoyed outdoor adventures. "Most people assume accountants are boring," I admitted. "Most people make a lot of assumptions," he said. "I find it's better to let people show you who they are rather than deciding for them." When we finally parted ways, he asked for my number. I gave it to him, though part of me expected never to hear from him again. Men like him, successful, attractive, clearly wealthy, didn't typically pursue women like me. But he texted that evening, "Thank you for turning my cancelled meeting into the best part of my day. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow somewhere? We're less likely to wear our food." Our first real date was at a small Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park. He picked me up in a car that probably cost more than my annual salary. But he didn't make a show of it. Instead, he asked about my day, remembered details from our coffee shop conversation, and made me laugh until my sides hurt. It wasn't until our third date that I learned exactly who Alexander Blackwood was. I'd Googled him. Of course, I wasn't completely naive, but seeing CEO, Blackwood Industries and net worth, $3.2 billion hadn't quite prepared me for the reality. "You could have mentioned you're basically a captain of industry," I said over dinner at another of his carefully chosen, intimate restaurants. He looked almost embarrassed. "I was hoping you'd get to know me before you knew about all that. People treat me differently when they know about the money." "How do they treat you differently?" "Like I'm not a real person, like I'm a walking bank account or a social media opportunity." "You talk to me like I was just Alex, the guy who spilled coffee on you." I hadn't experienced that in a long time. I understood then why he'd been so careful about revealing his identity. In our weeks of dating, he'd shown me who he was. Thoughtful, hardworking despite his wealth, passionate about his business and his charitable work. The money was just a circumstance, not his character. We kept our relationship quiet from the beginning. He respected my request not to be photographed together at public events, understanding instinctively that I needed to protect this precious thing we were building. My family had a talent for poisoning good things in my life, and I wasn't ready to give them the ammunition. Alexander traveled frequently for business, which actually helped keep our secret. When he was in town, We spent quiet evenings together, cooking dinner at his penthouse or taking long walks along the lakefront. He was teaching me to see myself through his eyes, capable, intelligent, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with Charlotte's definition of beauty. 3 weeks ago, he'd proposed, not with fanfare or public spectacle, but during one of our quiet Sunday mornings, over coffee and the newspaper spread between us on his kitchen island. "I love you, Emma Matthews." He'd said simply, "I love your mind, your heart, your strength. I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you how extraordinary you are." The ring was stunning, a flawless 5-carat diamond that caught the morning light streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows. But what took my breath away wasn't the ring itself, but the way he looked at me when he slipped it onto my finger. "Yes," I'd whispered, and he'd kissed me like I was the most precious thing in his world. Now, as I sat at Mom's birthday dinner listening to Charlotte predict my lonely future, I touched the ring I'd moved to my right hand for tonight. In 20 minutes, Alexander would walk through that door, and my family would finally see what he'd seen in me all along. Charlotte's wedding photo still held the place of honor on Mom's mantelpiece, even 3 years later. Every time I visited, there it was, Charlotte in her $15,000 designer gown, Marcus in his custom tuxedo, both of them glowing with what everyone assumed was happiness. The photo captured the moment right after their first kiss as husband and wife, surrounded by 300 guests in the ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton. That wedding had been the pinnacle of everything our family valued. Charlotte had landed the right kind of man. Marcus came from old money, worked in his father's investment firm, and belonged to all the proper clubs. The engagement announcement had run in the society pages, complete with a glossy photo of Charlotte's perfectly styled hair and Marcus's confident smile. For an entire year leading up to the wedding, it was all our family talked about. Mom quit her part-time job at the boutique to become Charlotte's full-time wedding coordinator. Dad took out a second mortgage to pay for the reception. Every family gathering revolved around cake tastings, venue visits, and endless discussions about Charlotte's vision. I remember the bridal shower particularly clearly because it perfectly encapsulated my role in the family hierarchy. I'd spent weeks organizing it, booking the private dining room at the country club, coordinating with 30 of Charlotte's friends, arranging the catering, and designing the invitations. I'd even paid for half of it when the cost exceeded Mom's budget. But when the day arrived, I wasn't seated with the immediate family. Instead, I was relegated to the cousins and family friends table, watching from across the room as Charlotte opened gift after gift. Each one met with squeals of delight from her sorority sisters. "Emma did such a good job putting this together," Mom announced at one point, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "She's so organized. We couldn't have done it without her." It was the kind of praise that sounds nice but actually diminishes. I wasn't the sister celebrating a milestone, just the helpful organizer in the background. Charlotte basked in the attention, while I collected wrapping paper and made sure the servers knew when to bring out the cake I'd special ordered from her favorite bakery. The bachelorette party was worse. Charlotte had chosen Las Vegas naturally, for a long weekend that cost each participant over $2,000. I'd struggled to afford it on my junior accountant's salary, putting the flight and hotel on a credit card I was still paying off years later. But Charlotte's friends made it clear I didn't quite fit in with their group. "Emma's so sweet," I'd overheard one of them saying in the hotel bathroom, "but she's just different from us. You know, she takes everything so seriously." They weren't wrong. While they spent the afternoon at the spa and the evening at exclusive clubs, I found myself checking emails from work and calculating how much this trip was setting me back financially. I felt like an outsider at my own sister's celebration, watching her live a life that seemed effortless and carefree while I worried about rent and student loan payments. The wedding day itself was a masterpiece of social theater. Charlotte looked absolutely stunning. There was no denying that. Her dress had been featured in Bridal magazine. Her hair and makeup were flawless, and she moved through the day with the confidence of someone who'd always been the center of attention. I'd been given a role in the ceremony, but not the one I'd secretly hoped for. Instead of being a bridesmaid, I was asked to do a reading during the service, a safe, functional role that kept me involved but not too visible. I wore a dress I'd bought on sale, had my hair done at a chain salon, and tried to smile through the complicated emotions of watching my sister achieve everything our family had taught us to want. During the reception, I watched Dad's toast with a mixture of pride and pain. He spoke eloquently about Charlotte's beauty, her charm, her ability to light up a room. He talked about how proud he was to see her marry such a wonderful man. How excited he was about the grandchildren they'd hopefully provide soon. Charlotte has always been our sunshine, he said, raising his glass. She brings joy wherever she goes, and we couldn't be happier to welcome Marcus to our family. The applause was thunderous. Charlotte glowed under the attention, and Marcus beamed beside her. It was a perfect moment that would be remembered and redoled for years to come. What Dad didn't mention was how Charlotte had dropped out of college twice before finally graduating. Or how she'd never held a job for more than 6 months, or how she'd racked up credit card debt that our parents had quietly paid off multiple times. He didn't talk about her struggles with responsibility or her tendency to expect others to clean up her messes. Instead, she was presented as the perfect daughter. The one who'd achieved the ultimate success. A good marriage to a wealthy man. And in our family's value system, that trumped everything else. My academic achievements, my growing career success, my financial independence, none of that mattered as much as Charlotte's ability to attract and marry the right kind of man. After the reception, as I helped clean up the endless flowers and decorations, I found myself wondering if this was all there was. Was this the pinnacle of female achievement in our family, to be beautiful enough, charming enough to convince a man to take care of you? The newlyweds moved into a stunning Lincoln Park townhouse that Marcus's parents bought for them as a wedding gift. Charlotte quit her job at the marketing agency, a position she'd only held for 4 months, to focus on making their house a home and planning charity events for Marcus's mother's foundation. For the first year of their marriage, every family gathering was filled with glowing updates about Charlotte's new life. The dinner parties she hosted, the vacations they took, the renovations they were planning. She'd found her calling as a society wife, and our parents couldn't have been more thrilled. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks at my accounting firm, studying for my CPA exam, and slowly building a career that would actually support me independently. But those achievements felt invisible next to Charlotte's glamorous updates about charity galas and weekend trips to Napa Valley. Now, sitting at Mom's birthday dinner 3 years later, I could see cracks in the perfect facade that Charlotte had built. Her smile seemed more forced, her laughter a little too loud. Marcus had been checking his phone throughout dinner, barely engaging in conversation, and Charlotte's designer handbag, the one she'd been so casually displaying earlier, was actually from last season. I'd noticed because Alexander had pointed out the same bag in a magazine article about investment pieces that were no longer trending. But our parents still saw only the golden daughter, the one who'd achieved everything they'd taught us to value. They had no idea that their overlooked daughter was about to completely redefine what success looked like in our family. What my family didn't know, what I deliberately kept from them, was that their boring accountant daughter had become one of the youngest senior partners in the history of Morrison and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious accounting firms. While they saw me as the family disappointment, I was actually managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars and earning a salary that would have shocked them. The promotion had come 8 months ago, after I'd successfully navigated a complex fraud investigation for a major pharmaceutical company. The case had made national news, though my role remained confidential due to client privilege. I'd spent 6 months untangling a web of financial deception that had cost investors over $50 million. Working with federal investigators and forensic specialists to piece together evidence that ultimately led to multiple arrests. Emma, this is extraordinary work, Richard Morrison, the firm's founding partner, had said when he called me into his office. Your attention to detail and analytical thinking saved our client from complete financial ruin. The pharmaceutical company's board specifically requested that you lead their ongoing financial oversight. The promotion came with a corner office, a substantial salary increase, and equity stake in the firm. My new compensation package put me well into 6 figures. With performance bonuses that had already exceeded my previous annual salary, I was 28 years old and financially independent in ways that most people my age could only dream of. But I'd made a deliberate choice to keep this success quiet from my family. Past experience had taught me that my achievements either got minimized or created uncomfortable dynamics that somehow ended up being my responsibility to manage. When I'd graduated from Northwestern with highest honors and immediately landed a position at Morrison and Associates, Mom's first reaction had been concern. But Emma, won't all those numbers be so boring? And you'll be working such long hours, how will you ever meet someone? When I'd bought my Lincoln Park condo 2 years later, a beautiful two-bedroom unit with lake views that I'd gotten at an excellent price due to my connections in the financial world. Dad had assumed I'd gotten help with the down payment. Good for you, honey. Did Northwestern have some kind of alumni assistance program? The assumption that I couldn't have achieved it on my own was so automatic that correcting it felt pointless. They simply couldn't conceive of quiet, serious Emma as someone capable of major financial success. So when the promotion came, I decided to let them continue thinking what they wanted to think. It was easier than dealing with the complex family dynamics that inevitably arose when I outperformed expectations. Charlotte was the success story. I was the steady, unremarkable one. Changing that narrative would require more emotional energy than I was willing to invest. My actual day-to-day work was fascinating and challenging in ways that would have surprised my family. I wasn't just doing taxes or checking numbers. As they imagined, I was solving complex puzzles, uncovering financial irregularities, and helping major corporations navigate intricate regulatory requirements. I worked with international clients, traveled to conferences, and had built a reputation within the industry as someone who could handle the most difficult cases. The pharmaceutical fraud case had been particularly satisfying. The company's CFO had been systematically inflating revenue figures and hiding losses through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. The scheme was sophisticated enough that it had fooled multiple auditing firms, but something about the quarterly reports had bothered me. The numbers added up mathematically, but they told a story that didn't quite make sense. I'd spent weeks diving deeper, following paper trails and analyzing patterns that others had missed. When I finally presented my findings to the board, the room had gone completely silent. 3 months later, the CFO and 2 other executives were arrested, and the company had recovered most of the stolen funds. You have a gift, Richard had told me. You see things others miss, and you have the persistence to follow your instincts even when the path isn't clear. That's what makes you extraordinary at this work. My clients trusted me with their most sensitive financial information. I had clearance to access records that revealed the true financial picture of companies worth billions of dollars. Board members who wouldn't return calls from most people took my meetings immediately, because they knew I didn't waste their time with anything less than critical insights. The work was demanding. Certainly, I regularly put in 60-hour weeks, especially during busy season, but it was also intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding in ways that made the long hours worthwhile. I loved the detective work aspect of forensic accounting, the satisfaction of uncovering the truth hidden in complex financial structures. My colleagues respected me, my clients valued my work, and I'd built a career that would provide security and growth opportunities for decades to come. I owned my condo outright, had a substantial investment portfolio, and could afford luxuries that I chose not to flaunt, like the vintage Hermes handbag sitting in my closet, a gift to myself. After closing the pharmaceutical case, but at family gatherings, I was still just Emma, the accountant who couldn't get a date. When relatives asked about my work, I gave vague answers about helping businesses with their finances and let them assume whatever they wanted to assume. It was simpler than explaining forensic accounting or dealing with the complicated emotions that rose when people realized how well I was actually doing. Charlotte had never asked a single specific question about my work. In her mind, accounting was accounting, boring, numbers-focused. Definitely not glamorous. She had no idea that I regularly attended galas for charitable organizations I audited, that I'd been profiled in industry publications, or that headhunters called me monthly with offers from competing firms. The irony wasn't lost on me. Charlotte, who lived entirely on Marcus's income and had never earned more than $35,000 in a year, regularly made comments about my little job and how I needed to aim higher if I ever wanted to attract a successful man. Meanwhile, I was out-earning most of the men she considered marriage material, building wealth through my own skills and determination. But tonight, all of that was about to change. When Alexander walked through that door, my family would finally see their overlooked daughter through different eyes, and more importantly, I would finally stop hiding who I'd become. Alexander Blackwood's world was one I'd never imagined entering, yet somehow I'd found my place in it more naturally than I'd found my place in my own family. His success wasn't inherited or gifted, it was built through intelligence, strategic thinking, and an almost obsessive attention to detail that resonated with my own professional approach. Blackwood Industries had started as a small tech consulting firm that Alexander founded right out of mid at age 22. Within 5 years, he'd transformed it into a major player in cybersecurity and data analytics, serving Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. By 30, he'd taken the company public. By 35, he'd expanded into artificial intelligence and machine learning, positioning Blackwood Industries at the forefront of technological innovation. But what I found most impressive about Alexander wasn't his wealth, it was his approach to business and life. He made decisions based on careful analysis rather than impulse, treated his employees like valued partners rather than expendable resources, and used his success to fund educational initiatives and technological research that benefited society. Broadly, money is just a tool, he'd told me during one of our early conversations. What matters is what you build with it, how you use it to create something meaningful. His penthouse reflected this philosophy. Yes, it was luxurious, floor-to-ceiling, windows overlooking Lake Michigan, custom furniture, artwork that belonged in museums. But it was also clearly a space where someone actually lived and worked. His home office was filled with technical journals, whiteboards covered in strategic planning notes, and prototypes of products his company was developing. Alexander worked harder than anyone I'd ever met, often starting his days at 5 a.m. with calls to international partners and ending them past midnight reviewing technical specifications. But he also made time for the things that mattered to him: reading voraciously, staying physically fit, and maintaining close relationships with the small circle of people he trusted. He'd been married before, briefly, in his late 20s. His ex-wife had been exactly what someone might expect for a billionaire, a former model with social media fame and an appetite for luxury shopping and high-profile events. The marriage had lasted 18 months. She loved the idea of being married to someone wealthy, Alexander had explained, but she wasn't particularly interested in me as a person. Every conversation was about where we'd be seen next, what events we'd attend, how she could leverage my success for her own social media brand. The divorce had been expensive and public, covered extensively in gossip magazines and business publications. Since then, Alexander had been extremely private about his personal life, declining most social invitations and focusing on his work and philanthropic projects. I started to think maybe I wasn't meant for relationships, he'd admitted. That maybe the money would always complicate things, make it impossible to know whether someone cared about me, or just what I could provide. Meeting me had changed that perspective. He'd fallen in love with Emma, the accountant who spilled coffee on him, who asked thoughtful questions about his work, who listened when he talked about the technical challenges he was trying to solve. The fact that I had my own career and financial independence meant he never had to wonder about my motivations. "You see me," he'd said one evening as we walked along the lakefront, "not the company, not the money, not what I can do for you, just me." I'd forgotten what that felt like. Our relationship had developed away from the public eye deliberately. Alexander valued privacy intensely, both because of his previous marriage and because high-profile relationships brought unwanted attention to his business dealings. We spent quiet evenings together, traveled to places where we could be anonymous, and built our connection on genuine compatibility rather than social expectations. He'd been planning tonight's surprise for weeks. The engagement ring had been custom designed by a jeweler he'd worked with before, incorporating elements that reflected both his attention to detail and his understanding of my personality. The 5-carat center stone was flawless, but it was the subtle design details that revealed how well he knew me. The elegant, classic setting that would work with my professional wardrobe. The comfortable bandwidth that wouldn't interfere with my daily work. But more than the ring itself, Alexander had planned his approach to meeting my family with the same strategic thinking he applied to major business decisions. He'd listened carefully to my stories about family dynamics, asked thoughtful questions about my relationships with my parents and Charlotte, and understood intuitively why I'd kept our relationship private. "They've underestimated you your entire life," he'd said after I told him about Charlotte's wedding and my role as the invisible organizer. They're about to learn who Emma Matthews really is. Alexander had flown back early from a business trip to London specifically for tonight. He'd been scheduled to spend the week in meetings with potential partners for a new AI initiative, but he'd rearranged his entire schedule when I'd mentioned Mom's birthday dinner. "This is important to you, which makes it important to me," he'd said simply. "Besides, it's time I met the people who raised the woman I'm going to marry." He'd arrived at O'Hare that afternoon and spent several hours at his office reviewing quarterly reports and finalizing a major contract, but his evening was completely dedicated to this moment. He'd chosen his outfit carefully, expensive but not flashy, professional but not intimidating. He wanted to make a good impression while also making it clear that he was someone who belonged in Emma's life. The engagement ring was in his jacket pocket along with a small velvet box containing a vintage necklace he'd found at an estate auction. The necklace had belonged to a Chicago socialite from the 1920s, and he'd been drawn to its history and craftsmanship. He'd planned to give it to me later, privately, as a symbol of our shared future in the city we both loved. Alexander understood that tonight would be complicated. He'd grown up in a family where love was conditional on performance, where relationships were strategic rather than authentic. His own parents had been wealthy but emotionally distant, more concerned with maintaining social status than nurturing their children. He recognized the patterns I described in my own family because he'd lived through similar dynamics, but he'd also learned, through years of therapy and personal growth, that it was possible to break those patterns and create healthier relationships. He saw potential in my family that I couldn't see yet, believing that they could learn to appreciate me if they understood what he'd seen from the beginning. As he drove toward my parents' house, Alexander felt both nervous and excited. This wasn't just about meeting my family. It was about officially beginning the next chapter of our life together. In his jacket pocket, along with the ring, was a folded piece of paper with notes he'd written about what he wanted to say when he proposed. At the top, in his precise handwriting, were the words that captured everything he felt. Emma Matthews sees the world clearly, works with integrity, and loves with her whole heart. I want to spend my life being worthy of that love. The irony of the entire evening was that I had planned and paid for almost every detail of Mom's 55th birthday celebration, yet I was still being treated like the family afterthought. 3 weeks ago, when I'd suggested we should do something special for Mom's milestone birthday, the family had enthusiastically agreed, and then promptly expected me to handle all the arrangements. I'd spent my Saturday morning at the florist, choosing the perfect centerpiece arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus that now graced the dining room table. The flowers alone had cost $200. Charged to my credit card because Charlotte had forgotten to bring cash and Mom had claimed she was too busy to deal with payment details. The catering had been my responsibility too. I'd researched restaurants, negotiated pricing, and coordinated delivery times with Antonio's, Mom's favorite Italian place. The spread was impressive: antipasto platters, homemade pasta with 3 different sauces, chicken marsala, and tiramisu for dessert. The entire meal cost $400, again paid from my account with vague promises from family members that they'd reimburse me later. I'd even handled the guest list and invitations. Though this had proven more complicated than expected, Charlotte had wanted to invite several of her friends, turning Mom's intimate birthday dinner into a social opportunity for herself. I diplomatically suggested that perhaps we should keep it to family this time, but Charlotte had overruled me. Mom would love to see everyone, she'd insisted. Besides, it's been forever since I've had a chance to catch up with the girls. So the guest list had expanded to include Charlotte's college roommate Jessica, her neighbor Tiffany, and Marcus's sister Rebecca. All women who barely knew our mother but were part of Charlotte's social circle. I'd redesigned the seating arrangement twice to accommodate the additional guests, ordered extra food, and extended the reservation time. The decorations throughout the house were my work too. I'd arrived at 10 a.m. to string lights, set up the gift table, and arrange the photo collage I'd spent hours creating from old family pictures. The collage was actually quite beautiful. A chronological journey through Mom's life with careful attention to color coordination and composition. It had taken me 3 evenings to complete, sorting through boxes of photos and selecting the best ones to tell her story. Charlotte had breezed in around 2 p.m. just as I was finishing the final touches, and immediately began rearranging things to her liking. "Emma, this looks so functional," she'd said, surveying my work. "Let me just add some touches to make it more elegant." She'd moved the centerpiece 6 inches to the left, adjusted the lighting to what she considered more flattering angles, and repositioned the gift table to be more prominent. Then she'd taken several photos for her Instagram story, captioning them "setting up for Mom's birthday. So excited to celebrate this amazing woman. #FamilyFirst #birthday vibes." The post had already received dozens of likes and comments praising Charlotte for being such a thoughtful daughter. No mention of who had actually done the work. Of course, I'd bitten my tongue. As usual, it wasn't worth the argument, and Mom seemed happy with how everything looked. But as I watched Charlotte accept compliments from the arriving guests about the beautiful party she'd organized, I felt the familiar sting of being invisible in my own family. The gift situation had been particularly galling. I'd spent considerable time choosing something meaningful for Mom. A vintage pearl necklace I'd found at an estate sale, similar to one she'd admired in old photos of her own mother. The necklace was beautiful and thoughtful, with a price tag that reflected both its quality and my affection for Mom. Charlotte's gift was a spa day certificate she'd bought online that morning, hastily wrapped in a gift bag from the drugstore. But when it came time for the gift presentation, she'd positioned herself prominently next to Mom and made sure everyone could see her enthusiastic reaction to the spa certificate. "Charlotte knows exactly what I need," Mom had gushed. "A day of pampering sounds absolutely perfect." My pearl necklace had been received with polite thanks and quickly set aside, overshadowed by the flashier promise of a spa experience. Even the birthday cake told the story of our family dynamics. I'd ordered it from Mom's favorite bakery, a custom chocolate cake with raspberry filling and buttercream frosting. The decoration was elegant, simple white frosting with "Happy 55th Birthday" written in Mom's favorite shade of blue. But when the cake was presented, Charlotte had immediately jumped up to take charge of the candle lighting ceremony, positioning herself for the photos and leading the singing of "Happy Birthday." It was a small thing, but symbolic of the larger pattern. I did the work. Charlotte got the credit. As I sat there listening to Charlotte's prediction about my lonely future, surrounded by the beautiful party I'd created, I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, the daughter who actually took care of things, who followed through on commitments, who invested time and money in making our family celebration special. Yet I was still seen as the disappointing one, the one who couldn't get her life together. But in 15 minutes, when Alexander walked through that door, all of these small humiliations and oversights would be reframed. The family would finally see that their boring accountant daughter had been living a completely different life than they'd imagined. The woman they'd dismissed as unsuccessful and unmarriageable was actually engaged to one of the most successful men in Chicago. I touched the engagement ring on my right hand, feeling its weight and the promise it represented. Tonight, everything would change. The conversation around the dinner table had taken an increasingly uncomfortable turn after Charlotte's pronouncement about my romantic future. What had started as general family catching up had devolved into what felt like a targeted analysis of everything wrong with my life, with each family member contributing their own observations and advice. "You know, Emma," Dad said, cutting into his chicken marsala, "your mother and I have been talking, and we're worried you're being too picky. Maybe you need to lower your standards a bit. Not every man is going to be perfect." I nearly choked on my wine. The idea that I was being too picky, when they had no idea I was engaged to someone who exceeded every possible standard, was both infuriating and absurd. "What your father means," Mom chimed in, "is that you're getting to an age where you need to think practically. You can't wait forever for Prince Charming. A nice, stable man who treats you well is worth more than some fantasy of romance." Charlotte's friend Jessica nodded sagely from across the table. My cousin was the same way. She was so focused on her career that she missed all the good guys. Now she's 35 and still single, and all the men her age want younger women. "Exactly," Charlotte said, warming to the theme. "Emma, you need to put yourself out there more. Join a gym, take some cooking classes, maybe update your wardrobe." Men notice these things. I glanced down at my Target dress, the same one that had prompted Charlotte's earlier comments about my fashion sense. In their minds, this represented everything wrong with my approach to life. I was too practical to focus on work too. Unwilling to invest in the kind of appearance and activities that attracted men. Marcus, who had been largely silent throughout dinner, suddenly looked up from his phone. Maybe Emma should try online dating. That's how everyone meets people now. Just post some good photos and cast a wide net. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Here was a man who had married Charlotte largely because she fit his family's expectations of an appropriate wife, offering advice on how I could improve my romantic prospects. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. I've actually tried to set Emma up a few times, Mom said, addressing the table as if I weren't sitting right there. Remember Sarah Morrison's son? He's a lawyer, very successful. But Emma said she was too busy with work to meet him for coffee. Too busy for coffee, Charlotte repeated, shaking her head sadly. Emma, you can't prioritize your job over finding a husband. Work will always be there. But the right man might not wait around forever. I checked my phone discreetly. Alexander had texted 20 minutes ago. Just finished at the office on my way. Can't wait to meet everyone. He should be arriving any moment now. Dad had moved on to his favorite topic. His disappointment about not having grandchildren. Your mother and I aren't getting any younger, you know. We'd like to be grandparents while we're still young enough to enjoy it. Charlotte and Marcus have been trying. But, he trailed off. Looking meaningfully at Charlotte, Charlotte's face tightened almost imperceptibly. This was clearly a sensitive subject, though she covered it quickly with a bright smile. We're just waiting for the right time. She said Marcus got that promotion last year. And we want to be financially stable before we start a family. The comment about financial stability was rich, coming from someone who had never held a steady job and lived entirely on her husband's income. But I noticed something else. The way Marcus's jaw twitched when Charlotte mentioned his promotion, and how Charlotte's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. Well, don't wait too long, Mom advised. Biology doesn't care about perfect timing. Unlike Emma, at least Charlotte has the option, Dad added with a laugh that wasn't entirely kind. She found herself a good husband while she was still young enough to be choosy. The implication hung in the air, that at 28, I was already past my prime, settling into spinsterhood through my own poor choices and unrealistic expectations. Around the table, everyone nodded in agreement with this assessment of my life. I found myself thinking about Alexander's perspective on all of this. He'd grown up in a similarly dysfunctional family environment, where love was conditional and relationships were viewed as strategic rather than emotional. But he'd learned to see beyond those limiting beliefs, to recognize that healthy relationships were built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than settling for whatever was available. Maybe Emma's problem is that she spends too much time with numbers, suggested Tiffany, Charlotte's neighbor. Accounting isn't exactly a social profession. She needs to get out more, meet people in different environments. That's a good point, Charlotte agreed. Emma, when was the last time you went to a party or a social event where you might actually meet someone? You can't find a husband sitting at home doing taxes. The conversation was becoming increasingly absurd. Here I was, engaged to a billionaire, who respected my intelligence and valued my professional success, listening to my family analyze why I was such a romantic failure. They had created an entire narrative about my limitations and shortcomings, none of which bore any resemblance to reality. But what struck me most was how comfortable they all seemed with this dynamic. They weren't trying to be cruel, this was simply how they saw me and how they'd always seen me. In their minds, they were being helpful, offering honest feedback about my flaws and practical advice for improvement. Charlotte was just getting started on her analysis of my romantic shortcomings when I heard a car door close in the driveway. My heart started beating faster. Alexander was here. The thing is, Emma, Charlotte continued, oblivious to my sudden alertness, you have to face reality. You're not getting any younger. And you're not exactly, she gestured vaguely at my appearance. Well, you know, maybe it's time to focus on finding someone stable and kind rather than holding out for some fantasy. I heard footsteps on the front porch, then the doorbell rang. The conversation around the table paused as everyone looked toward the front door. Are we expecting someone else? Mom asked, looking confused. I stood up, my pulse racing with anticipation and nerves. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Actually, I said, smoothing down my target dress and walking toward the front door. Yes, there's someone I'd like you all to meet." The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. I could feel everyone's eyes on me as I walked to the front door, their confusion palpable. Behind me, I heard Charlotte whisper urgently to Marcus, "Who could she possibly be expecting?" I opened the door to find Alexander standing on the front porch, and for a moment, I was struck again by how commanding his presence was. He wore a charcoal gray suit that was clearly custom-tailored, his dark hair perfectly styled. Despite the Chicago wind, in his hand was a beautiful bouquet of white orchids, Mom's favorite flowers. Though he'd only learned that from our conversations. "Hello, beautiful," he said softly, leaning down to kiss my cheek. Then, loud enough for the dining room to hear, "I'm sorry I'm late, the meeting ran longer than expected." He handed me the orchids with a smile that made my heart flutter, then looked past me toward the dining room where my family sat frozen in stunned silence. "These must be the famous Matthews family I've heard so much about," Alexander said, his voice warm and confident. "I'm Alexander Blackwood. Emma's told me wonderful things about all of you." I turned to see my family's reactions, and it was like watching a car accident in slow motion. Dad's fork was suspended halfway to his mouth, a piece of chicken marsala threatening to fall back onto his plate. Mom's wineglass sat forgotten in her hand as she stared at Alexander with undisguised shock. Charlotte's perfectly glossed mouth had fallen open, her usual composure completely shattered. But it was Marcus who provided the most telling reaction. He'd gone completely pale, his phone clattering onto the table as he stared at Alexander with what could only be described as recognition and panic. "Alexander Blackwood," Marcus repeated weakly, "of Blackwood Industries." "That's right," Alexander replied pleasantly, stepping into the house and placing a protective hand on the small of my back. "Though tonight I'm just Emma's boyfriend, thank you for including me in your celebration." The word boyfriend hit the room like a physical force. Charlotte actually made a small choking sound, while Dad slowly lowered his fork to his plate without taking the bite. "Emma," Mom finally managed, her voice unnaturally high. "You didn't mention that you were seeing someone. It's still relatively new," I said, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. "Alexander, let me introduce everyone. This is my mother, Patricia, and my father, Robert. My sister Charlotte and her husband Marcus, and these are Charlotte's friends Jessica, Tiffany, and Rebecca." Alexander moved through the introductions with the kind of polished grace that comes from years of high-stakes business meetings and social events. He shook hands with Dad, who seemed to have forgotten how to speak, and kissed Mom's hand in a gesture that was charming rather than presumptuous. "Mrs. Matthews, you have a lovely home," Alexander said, "and Emma has told me so much about you. I understand you're celebrating a milestone birthday. Many happy returns." Mom blushed like a teenager. "Oh, well, thank you, that's very..." "Emma, why don't you get Alexander a chair and maybe some dinner?" "Actually," Alexander said, "I ate at the office, but I'd love to join you for a few minutes if that's all right." I quickly retrieved a chair from the kitchen, and Alexander settled in next to me at the table. The silence was profound and awkward, broken only by the sound of Marcus nervously drumming his fingers against his water glass. Charlotte was the first to recover her voice, though her usual confidence was notably absent. "So Alexander," she said, her tone carefully casual, "what kind of work do you do?" "I run a technology company," Alexander replied modestly. "We specialize in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence applications." This was the understatement of the century, and Marcus knew it. Blackwood Industries was one of the most successful tech companies in the Midwest, with government contracts and Fortune 500 clients. Marcus worked in finance. He absolutely knew who Alexander was and what he was worth. "That sounds interesting," Charlotte managed, though she clearly had no idea what to do with this information. Dad seemed to be struggling to process the situation. His gaze kept moving between Alexander's obviously expensive suit, his confident bearing, and me sitting there in my Target dress looking like I belonged next to him. "Emma never mentioned she was dating anyone," Dad said finally, a note of accusation in his voice. "We've been keeping things private," Alexander explained smoothly. "Emma values her privacy, and I respect that. But when she mentioned her mother's birthday celebration, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to meet the people who raised such an extraordinary woman." The word extraordinary seemed to hang in the air. When was the last time anyone in my family had used that word to describe me? Jessica, Charlotte's friend, was staring at Alexander with undisguised interest. Blackwood Industries, she said slowly, aren't you the company that just signed that huge government contract? I read about it in Forbes. Alexander smiled politely. We don't typically discuss specific client relationships, but yes, we've been fortunate to work with various government agencies on cybersecurity initiatives. The Forbes article Jessica was referencing had described the contract as worth over $500 million. I watched this information sink in around the table, saw the moment when everyone began to understand exactly who was sitting in their dining room. Charlotte was looking between Alexander and me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between confusion and what might have been fear. Her earlier confidence about my romantic prospects seemed to be crumbling in real time. Well, Mom said, clearly struggling to adjust to this new reality. This is certainly unexpected, Emma. You've been very secretive about your personal life. Not secretive, I corrected gently. Just private. Alexander and I prefer to keep our relationship out of the public eye. Alexander reached over and took my hand. The gesture natural and possessive. Emma's privacy is one of the things I admire most about her, he said. She's not interested in attention or publicity. She values substance over appearance. The irony of this comment, given Charlotte's earlier critiques of my appearance and social life, was not lost on anyone. Charlotte's face had gone from pale to flushed, and she was gripping her wine glass so tightly I was worried it might shatter. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Mr. Blackwood, I work in investment finance. I've followed your company's growth. It's been remarkable. Thank you, Alexander replied graciously. Emma actually gives me excellent advice on the financial side of things. Her analytical mind is invaluable for understanding complex market dynamics. Another silence fell over the table as everyone processed this information. Emma the boring accountant was giving financial advice to a tech billionaire. Emma the romantic failure was dating one of Chicago's most successful bachelors. Emma the family disappointment was sitting next to a man who clearly adored her. But what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Actually, he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, there's something I've been wanting to ask Emma tonight. And I can't think of a better time than surrounded by the people she loves most. The velvet box seemed to glow under the dining room lights, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Even though Alexander and I had already discussed marriage, even though I was wearing his ring on my right hand, this moment was entirely unexpected. We'd agreed to keep the engagement private until after tonight, but here he was, about to propose. In front of my entire family. Alexander stood up from his chair, and the room went completely silent. Charlotte's wineglass finally did slip from her fingers, hitting the table with a sharp clink that made everyone jump. Marcus looked like he might faint. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Emma Matthews, Alexander said, his voice clear and strong. 6 months ago, you literally ran into my life and changed everything. You saw me not as a company or a bank account, but as a person worth knowing. You challenged my thinking, supported my dreams, and showed me what real partnership looks like. He dropped to one knee beside my chair, and I heard someone, I think it was Jessica, gasp audibly. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. You are brilliant, compassionate, and stronger than you know. You've built an incredible career through your own talent and determination. You handle every challenge with grace and intelligence, and somehow, impossibly, you've chosen to share your life with me. Alexander opened the box, revealing the stunning 5-carat diamond that caught the light and threw rainbows across the ceiling. Around the table, I could hear sharp intakes of breath. Emma, will you marry me? For a moment, the world seemed suspended. I looked around the table at my family's shocked faces, Dad's mouth hanging open, Mom's eyes filling with tears, Charlotte staring at the ring with an expression of complete disbelief. These were the people who, just minutes ago, had been analyzing my romantic failures and offering advice on how to lower my standards. Yes, I whispered, then louder, yes, Alexander, of course yes. He slipped the ring onto my left hand. I'd moved his original ring to my right hand in preparation for tonight. The diamond was even more beautiful in this setting, surrounded by the people who had never believed this moment would come. Alexander stood and kissed me, and for a moment, the dining room faded away. This was real, this incredible man, this beautiful life we were building together. This future that was nothing like what my family had imagined for me. When we broke apart, the silence continued for several long seconds. Finally, Mom found her voice. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Emma, this is incredible. I can't believe, when did this happen? How long have you been planning this?" "We've been talking about marriage for a while," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, but Alexander wanted to ask officially in front of family. Dad was staring at the ring on my finger like it might disappear if he blinked. That's quite a ring," he managed. "Emma deserves the best," Alexander said simply, settling back into his chair but keeping my hand in his. "She's an extraordinary woman, and I wanted the ring to reflect that." Charlotte finally found her voice, though it came out strangulated. "Congratulations," she said, the word sounding like it was physically painful to say. "This is very sudden." "Not sudden," Alexander corrected gently. "We've been together for 6 months." "When you know," Jessica was practically bouncing in her seat. "Oh my God, Charlotte, your sister is engaged to Alexander Blackwood. Do you realize how incredible this is? He's like, famous, and so handsome." Charlotte's smile looked like it had been painted on. "Yes," she said tightly, "very exciting." Marcus was studying Alexander with an expression that seemed part admiration, part terror. "Mr. Blackwood," he said carefully, "I have to ask, how did you and Emma meet?" Alexander smiled, and I could see he was enjoying telling our story. "Emma literally ran into me at a coffee shop, spilled coffee all over both of us. Most people would have been mortified. But Emma just started solving the problem, figuring out dry cleaning, offering to pay for damages. She turned a disaster into the best part of my day." "That sounds like Emma," Mom said, and for the first time all evening, there was genuine warmth in her voice when she talked about me. "She's always been our problem solver." "She still is," Alexander agreed. "Emma sees solutions where others see obstacles. It's one of the many things I love about her." Dad was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to wake up from a dream. "I have to say, Emma, you've surprised us all tonight. We had no idea you were even dating someone, let alone someone so accomplished." "Emma's accomplished too," Alexander said, and there was a slight edge to his voice that suggested he'd picked up on the family dynamics more quickly than I'd expected. "She's one of the youngest senior partners in her firm's history. Her clients trust her with portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She's brilliant at what she does." This information hit the table like another bombshell. Senior partner. Hundreds of millions. I could see the questions forming in my family's eyes. The realization that they'd been operating with completely outdated information about my life. "Senior partner," Mom repeated weakly. "Emma, you never mentioned, it happened 8 months ago," I said. "I've been meaning to tell you, but the timing never seemed right." The truth was, I'd been waiting for a moment when the achievement could be celebrated rather than minimized or complicated by family jealousy. But sitting here next to Alexander, with his ring on my finger and his unwavering support, I felt strong enough to own my success. Charlotte was looking at me like she'd never seen me before. 8 months ago. But you never said anything. We thought you were just working at the same place." "I am working at the same place," I said. "I've just been promoted several times." Alexander squeezed my hand. "Emma's being modest. She solved a major fraud case that made national news. Her work saved her client over $50 million. The room went quiet again as everyone processed this information. The boring accountant's sister had not only landed a billionaire fiancé, but was apparently a high-powered forensic accountant with a track record of major successes. Tiffany was staring at me with something approaching awe. "Emma, I had no idea you were so successful. You always seemed so quiet and underestimated," Alexander finished, his tone polite but pointed. "Emma doesn't need to announce her achievements to know her worth. That's one of the things I admire most about her." Charlotte's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, and she was now gripping the edge of the table like she needed physical support. "This is all very overwhelming," she said. "I mean, congratulations. But this is such a surprise. I'm sorry we didn't tell you sooner," I said, though I wasn't really sorry at all. "We wanted to be sure about our relationship before involving family." Alexander pulled out his phone and showed Mom a photo. "This is the house we're looking at," he said. "Emma fell in love with the gardens. We're hoping to have the wedding there in the spring." The photo showed a stunning estate in Lake Forest. With rolling lawns and mature oak trees, it was the kind of property that appeared in architectural magazines, and it was clear from the image that this was where very wealthy people lived and entertained. Mom stared at the photo, then at me, then at Alexander. "You're planning to live there? If Emma likes it," Alexander said, though she's been lobbying for something more modest. "She keeps talking about the practicality of heating bills." This got a genuine laugh from Dad, the first natural response he'd had all evening. "That's definitely Emma, always thinking about the practical side." For the first time, being practical was presented as a virtue rather than a limitation. I felt something shift in the room's energy, a subtle recognition that maybe the traits they'd always seen as Emma's weaknesses were actually strengths that had attracted an extraordinary man. Alexander stood up again, reaching into his other jacket pocket. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling out another small box. "This belonged to my grandmother. I thought you might like to have something with family history." He opened the box to reveal a vintage pearl necklace, similar to the one I'd given Mom earlier but clearly much more valuable. The pearls were lustrous and perfectly matched, with an Art Deco clasp that spoke of both quality and history. "Alexander," I breathed, "it's beautiful." He fastened it around my neck, his fingers gentle. "At my nape, my grandmother would have loved you," he said softly. "She believed that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect and shared values." As I touched the pearls, I caught Charlotte staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For the first time in our lives, I was the sister with the attention, the achievements, the romantic success. And judging by her face, Charlotte was having trouble processing this reversal of everything she'd always believed about our family hierarchy. The transformation in my family's behavior was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me, to ask questions about my relationship, to hear details about my life that they'd never shown interest in before. It was fascinating and deeply uncomfortable to watch people who had dismissed me for years suddenly treating me like I mattered. "Emma, you have to tell us everything," Mom gushed, her voice taking on a tone of excitement I'd rarely heard directed at me. "How long have you known you wanted to marry him? Have you started planning the wedding? Oh my goodness, we have so much to discuss." Dad was studying Alexander with the kind of attention he usually reserved for football games. "So, Alexander, tell me about your business. Emma's always been good with numbers, but technology, that's quite an accomplishment." "Emma's analytical skills translate perfectly to technology," Alexander replied. "She understands complex systems and can spot inefficiencies that others miss. I actually consult her on major financial decisions." This was news to my family, who had always assumed my work was basic bookkeeping rather than high-level financial analysis. I watched Dad process this information, saw him beginning to recalculate his understanding of my professional value. Charlotte had gone eerily quiet, her usual chatter replaced by tense silence. She was staring at my engagement ring with an expression that bordered on disbelief, occasionally glancing up at Alexander like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be having some kind of internal crisis. He kept looking at his phone, then at Alexander, then back at his phone. His face had gone pale, and there was a thin line of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Marcus, are you feeling all right?" Mom asked, noticing his distress. "Fine," he said quickly. Then to Alexander, "I actually follow Blackwood Industries quite closely. Your stock performance has been remarkable." Alexander nodded politely. "We've been fortunate, good team, smart investments, favorable market conditions. The government contracts alone must be worth." Marcus trailed off, clearly calculating numbers in his head. "We don't discuss specific contract values," Alexander said, diplomatically, "but we're grateful for the trust our clients place in us." Jessica had been unusually quiet, but now she leaned forward with renewed interest. "So Emma, what's it like dating someone so successful? Do you get to go to fancy events and meet celebrities?" I glanced at Alexander, who gave me an encouraging smile. "We prefer quiet evenings together," I said. "Alexander works long hours, and so do I. We both value privacy." "But surely you go to galas and things," Tiffany pressed. "I mean, people like Alexander must get invited to everything." "We do attend some charity events," Alexander admitted. "Emma's particularly passionate about educational initiatives. She's been helping me develop a scholarship program for underprivileged Students interested in accounting and finance. This was the first my family had heard of my involvement in philanthropy. Mainly because I'd never felt comfortable discussing it with people who saw charity work as social networking rather than genuine service. You're starting a scholarship program, Dad asked, his voice reflecting surprise and something that might have been pride. Alexander's starting it, I corrected. I'm just helping with the structure and selection criteria. Emma's being modest. Again, Alexander said. The program was her idea. She's passionate about creating opportunities for students who have the talent but not the resources. Charlotte finally found her voice, though it came out strained. That's very admirable. Emma's always been so responsible. The word responsible hung in the air with the weight of years of dismissal. In Charlotte's vocabulary, responsible had always been code for boring, unexciting, lacking in spontaneity, but sitting next to Alexander, who clearly valued responsibility as an attractive quality, the word took on new meaning. Responsibility is underrated, Alexander said, his tone suggesting he understood the subtext. Emma follows through on her commitments. When she says she'll do something, it gets done. That's rare in my experience. I felt a flush of pride at his words, partly because they were true and partly because my family was hearing someone speak about my character traits as assets rather than limitations. Mom was practically vibrating with excitement. We need to plan an engagement party. Oh, Emma, this is so wonderful. We'll invite everyone, the whole family, all our friends. They won't believe it. Actually, I said carefully. Alexander and I prefer to keep things small. We're thinking about a quiet ceremony. Just immediate family. Nonsense, Mom said immediately. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. You can't have a small wedding when you're marrying someone so prominent. Alexander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll do whatever makes Emma happy, he said firmly. This is her day, and she should have exactly the wedding she wants. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be another event where Emma's preferences were overruled by family expectations. I felt a surge of gratitude for his protection. For the way he naturally shielded me from the family dynamics he was only beginning to understand. Dad was shaking his head in amazement. I have to say, Emma, I never would have guessed. You've always been so quiet about your personal life. And her professional life, apparently, Mom added, senior partner. Emma, why didn't you tell us about your promotion? I could have pointed out that they'd never asked about my work beyond polite inquiries about whether I was still doing accounting. I could have mentioned that every time I'd tried to share professional achievements, the conversation had been redirected to Charlotte's latest social activities. But with Alexander's hand warm in mine and his ring sparkling on my finger, those old hurts seemed less important. I wanted to wait until things settled down, I said diplomatically. Charlotte was fidgeting with her napkin, tearing it into small pieces without seeming to realize what she was doing. So, she said, her voice unnaturally bright, when's the wedding? Have you set a date? We're thinking late spring, Alexander replied. Emma wants time to plan something meaningful rather than rushing into it. Spring weddings are lovely, Mom said automatically, then paused as something occurred to her. Oh, Emma, you'll need to find a dress, and we'll need to book venues soon. The good places fill up quickly. The assumption that she would be involved in planning my wedding was so automatic that she didn't even question it. But Alexander stepped in smoothly. Emma and I are looking forward to planning together, he said. We both have pretty specific ideas about what we want. Marcus suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Excuse me, he said, his voice tight. I need to make a quick phone call. He hurried out of the room, leaving Charlotte staring after him with confusion and what looked like mounting panic. Is everything all right? Alexander asked, his tone concerned but his eyes sharp. I could tell he'd noticed Marcus's strange behavior throughout the evening. Fine, Charlotte said quickly. He's been under a lot of stress at work lately, big deal closing next week. But her explanation sounded hollow, and she couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes when she said it. The conversation continued around the table, but I found myself watching Charlotte's face as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. For the first time in our lives, I was the sister getting the attention, the praise, the excited questions about my future. Charlotte was the one sitting quietly, looking uncomfortable and out of place. It should have felt like vindication after years of being overshadowed, overlooked, and underestimated. justice was finally being served. But looking at Charlotte's strained expression, I felt something unexpected. Sympathy. This reversal of fortune wasn't just changing how my family saw me. It was forcing them to re-examine everything they'd believed about success, value, and worth. And Charlotte, who had built her entire identity around being the favored daughter, was having to confront the possibility that she'd been playing the wrong game all along. Marcus's absence stretched on, and I could see Charlotte growing more agitated with each passing minute. She kept glancing toward the hallway where he'd disappeared, her fingers drumming nervously against the table. When she thought no one was looking, she pulled out her phone and sent what appeared to be several urgent text messages. "Charlotte, dear, are you all right?" Mom asked, finally noticing her daughter's distress. "You seem upset." "I'm fine," Charlotte said quickly, but her voice was pitched higher than usual. "Just wondering what's taking Marcus so long." Alexander had been observing the family dynamics with the kind of analytical attention he probably brought to business meetings. "Would you like me to check on him?" he offered politely. "No." Charlotte's response was so sharp that everyone turned to stare at her. She forced a laugh. "I mean, no thank you. He's probably just dealing with work stuff. You know how it is." But we could all hear Marcus's voice from the front porch. And it didn't sound like a business call. His tone was urgent, almost pleading. Though we couldn't make out specific words, Dad was still processing the evening's revelations. "Emma, I have to ask, how did you manage to keep all of this secret? Dating Alexander, your promotion, the engagement, that's quite a lot to keep to yourself." "I like privacy," I said simply, "and I wanted to be sure about things before involving family." The implication hung in the air. That my family's track record of being supportive wasn't strong enough to risk sharing good news prematurely. Alexander squeezed my hand. "Emma's very thoughtful about timing," he said. "She wanted tonight to be about your mother's birthday before making any announcements." This was generous interpretation of my motives, and we all knew it, but it allowed my parents to save face while acknowledging their tendency to overshadow other people's moments. Charlotte suddenly stood up, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I should check on Marcus," she announced. "He's been under so much pressure lately." She hurried toward the front door, but we could hear Marcus's conversation ending abruptly. A moment later, both of them returned to the dining room, but the atmosphere between them was clearly strained. Marcus's face was ashen, and Charlotte looked like she was about to cry. They sat down heavily, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the table. "Everything all right?" Dad asked. "Fine," Marcus said curtly, but his hands were shaking as he reached for his water glass. Charlotte was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between desperation and calculation. "Emma," she said suddenly, "can I talk to you privately for a minute?" Alexander looked at me questioningly, and I nodded. Of course. Charlotte led me into the kitchen, closing the door behind us. For a moment she just stood there, her usual confidence completely absent. "Emma," she began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with how to continue. "I need to tell you something about Marcus and me." I waited, sensing that whatever was coming would be significant. "We're not doing as well as everyone thinks," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "Financially, I mean Marcus. He made some bad investments last year. We're in serious trouble." This explained Marcus's reaction to Alexander's presence. If they were struggling financially, being in the same room with a billionaire must have been particularly painful. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Charlotte's laugh was bitter. "Help? Emma, do you realize what just happened in there? You went from being the family disappointment to being engaged to one of the richest men in Chicago. Meanwhile, my perfect marriage is falling apart, and we're about to lose the house." The raw pain in her voice was surprising. I'd never heard Charlotte sound so vulnerable, so stripped of her usual bravado. "Charlotte, I had no idea things were that bad." "Of course you didn't," she said, but without her usual venom. "We've been pretending everything was fine." Marcus's pride wouldn't let him admit we were struggling, but tonight, seeing you with Alexander, it's like watching someone else live the life I thought I had. I felt a complex mix of emotions, sympathy for Charlotte's situation, but also frustration with her assumption that my success somehow diminished hers. "My relationship with Alexander doesn't change anything about your marriage," I said gently. "Doesn't?" Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Emma, for the first time in our lives, you're the successful one. You're the one with the perfect man, the perfect future. Do you know how that feels for someone who's always been the golden child? The honesty was startling. Charlotte had never acknowledged the family dynamics so directly, had never admitted that she'd been aware of her favored status. Charlotte, you've had advantages I never had, mom and dad's support, their pride, their attention. You've been the center of this family for as long as I can remember, and what did it get me? She asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. A marriage to a man who turned out to be terrible with money. No career skills because I never thought I'd need them, and a lifestyle I can't afford. Meanwhile, you quietly built a career and found someone who actually values you. The admission was painful to hear. Partly because it revealed how much Charlotte had been struggling beneath her perfect exterior. It's not too late, I said. You could go back to school, develop your own career. Marcus's financial problems don't have to define your future. Charlotte shook her head. You don't understand. It's not just money problems. Marcus has been different lately. Distant, I think. He's seeing someone else. This revelation explained the tension I'd observed between them throughout dinner. Charlotte wasn't just dealing with financial stress. Her entire life was unraveling. Have you talked to him about it? How can I? If I confront him about the affair, he might leave. And if he leaves, I have nothing, no job, no money, no prospects. I'd have to move back in with mom and dad. The thought of Charlotte, who had lived independently since college, having to return to our parents' house clearly terrified her. You're stronger than you think, I told her. You have skills and talents that you've never had to use. This could be an opportunity to build something that's actually yours. Charlotte looked at me with something that might have been hope. Do you really think so, or are you just being nice because you feel sorry for me? The question caught me off guard. I realized that despite our complicated history, I did want Charlotte to succeed. Not because I felt sorry for her, but because I genuinely believed she was capable of more than she'd ever attempted. I think you're smart and resourceful, I said honestly. You've just never had to rely on those qualities because other people were taking care of you. But they're there. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us processing this unexpected conversation. Then Charlotte asked the question I'd been dreading. Emma, would you consider, if Marcus and I really are headed for divorce and if things get really bad financially, would you be able to help? I know you're successful now, and with Alexander. The request hung between us, complicated by years of family dynamics and hurt feelings. Charlotte was asking me to be her safety net, something she'd never been for me. Let's see what happens. I said diplomatically, maybe things with Marcus aren't as bad as they seem. But even as I said it, we could hear raised voices from the dining room. Marcus and Alexander were having some kind of intense conversation, and it didn't sound friendly. Charlotte and I hurried back to find Marcus standing over Alexander, his face red with anger or embarrassment. You don't understand, Marcus was saying. It's not that simple. The market conditions were impossible to predict. Alexander remained seated, his expression calm but watchful. I'm not judging your investment decisions, he said evenly. I was simply offering perspective on the current market trends. It was clear that their conversation had moved from polite small talk to something much more personal and volatile. Marcus looked like a man who'd been pushed to his breaking point, while Alexander maintained the controlled demeanor of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. The rest of the family was watching this exchange with growing alarm, unsure of what had triggered Marcus's outburst but recognizing that the evening had taken a dramatically uncomfortable turn. The tension in the room was palpable as Charlotte and I returned from the kitchen. Marcus was still standing, his face flushed, while Alexander remained seated with the kind of calm that suggested years of dealing with difficult personalities in high-stakes situations. What's going on? Charlotte asked, though her voice suggested she already knew this was about their financial problems. Nothing, Marcus said quickly, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Just a difference of opinion about market strategies. Alexander's expression was carefully neutral. I apologize if I overstepped, he said to the table generally. Marcus was asking about investment approaches, and I may have been too direct in my response, but Dad, who had decades of experience reading people in business situations, was studying both men with sharp attention. Marcus, maybe you should sit down, You look like you're about to have a stroke. I'm fine, Marcus snapped, then immediately looked stricken at his own tone. Sorry, I'm just. It's been a long week. Mom was looking between Marcus and Charlotte, with growing concern. Is everything all right with you two? You both seem very stressed tonight. This was the moment when everything could have continued as it always had. Polite deflection, surface-level conversations, problems swept under the rug for the sake of family harmony. But something in me had shifted. Sitting next to Alexander, wearing his ring, feeling his quiet support, I found myself unwilling to participate in the family's usual pattern of avoiding difficult truths. Actually, I said, surprising myself with my directness, I think there are some things we should talk about openly. The room went quiet. My family wasn't accustomed to direct confrontation. Especially not from me, Emma. Mom said carefully. Maybe this isn't the right time. When would be the right time? I asked. When has this family ever been willing to talk honestly about what's really going on? Alexander placed a gentle hand on my arm, not to stop me but to let me know he was there. I drew strength from his presence and continued. For years, I've sat at family gatherings and listened to subtle criticisms about my life, my choices, my appearance, my romantic prospects. Tonight, before Alexander arrived, I was getting advice on how to lower my standards and settle for whoever would have me. Charlotte's face went pale. Emma, we were just trying to help, were you? I asked, because it felt a lot like judgment. Like disappointment that I hadn't managed to achieve the one thing this family seems to value. Marriage to a financially successful man. Dad shifted uncomfortably. That's not fair, Emma. We just want you to be happy. Do you? I turned to face him directly. Because when I graduated valedictorian, you barely looked up from the television. When I got my CPA license, you forgot to congratulate me. When I was promoted to senior partner, a position that less than 5% of accountants ever achieve, I didn't tell you because I knew it would somehow become about Charlotte's latest social event. The words were coming out faster now. Years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. I have spent my entire adult life watching this family celebrate Charlotte's achievements while mine were ignored or minimized, and tonight the only reason any of you care about my success is because it's reflected in Alexander's presence. Alexander squeezed my hand gently. Emma, he said quietly, you don't have to. Yes, I do, I said, feeling a strange sense of liberation. Because this pattern doesn't just hurt me, it hurts all of us. Charlotte, you've been so focused on being the perfect daughter that you never developed the skills to be independent. Mom and Dad, you've been so invested in maintaining an image of family success that you've missed actually supporting your children's real achievements. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Emma, we love you, we're proud of you, are you? I asked. Because I've never felt that. I felt tolerated, managed, sometimes pitied, but proud, no. The silence that followed was heavy with uncomfortable truths. Finally, Dad spoke. Maybe we haven't always. Maybe we could have done better at showing our appreciation for your accomplishments. It was a careful admission, the kind of partial acknowledgement that allowed for face-saving while recognizing fault. Charlotte was crying now, quiet tears that she wasn't bothering to wipe away. Emma, I'm sorry, you're right about everything. I've been selfish and thoughtless, and I've taken advantage of your kindness for years. Marcus sat down heavily. His earlier anger replaced by what looked like defeat. I owe everyone an apology, he said. I've been under enormous pressure, and I took it out on Alexander when he was just trying to be helpful. What kind of pressure? Dad asked, his tone gentler now. Marcus looked at Charlotte, who nodded reluctantly. We're in serious financial trouble, he admitted. I made some very bad investment decisions last year. We're facing foreclosure on the house. And I've been trying to figure out how to tell everyone. The admission hung in the air. Another family secret finally brought into the light. Why didn't you say something sooner? Mom asked. We could have helped, or at least provided support. Because I was ashamed, Marcus said simply. And because Charlotte's identity is so tied up in our lifestyle that I didn't know how to admit I'd failed to maintain it. Charlotte reached for his hand. We failed, she corrected. I put pressure on you to maintain a standard of living we couldn't afford. I never learned to live within our means because I never had to. Alexander had been listening to these revelations with the kind of attention he probably brought to complex business problems. If I may, he said carefully, financial difficulties aren't insurmountable. There are strategies for debt management, restructuring, even bankruptcy if necessary. The shame around money problems is often worse than the actual problems themselves. Marcus looked at him with something approaching gratitude. I know you're trying to help, and I appreciate it. But when you're facing foreclosure and your wife's family thinks you're successful, it's hard to know how to ask for guidance. You start by telling the truth, I said, like we're doing now. Mom was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Emma, I owe you the biggest apology. We've taken you for granted for so long that we forgot to actually see you tonight, watching Alexander talk about your achievements, hearing about your success. I realized how much we've missed. Dad nodded slowly. Your mother's right. We got so caught up in Charlotte's social successes that we failed to recognize your professional ones. That's on us. Not you, Alexander spoke up, his voice warm but firm. Emma doesn't need your recognition to validate her worth. She's built an incredible life through her own talent and determination. But she deserves family support and celebration. Just like anyone else. The message was clear. He would protect me from further dismissal or undervaluation. My family would need to earn the right to be part of our life together. Charlotte wiped her eyes and looked directly at me. Emma, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but could we start over? Could I learn to be the sister you deserved all along? The question was so unexpected, so genuine, that it caught me completely off guard. I looked around the table at my family, flawed, complicated, but finally, being honest about their failures and limitations. I'd like that, I said quietly, but it means real change, not just better intentions. What would that look like? Mom asked. I thought for a moment, feeling Alexander's steady presence beside me. It means treating my achievements as worthy of celebration. It means asking about my life because you're genuinely interested, not because you feel obligated. It means supporting each other through real problems instead of maintaining perfect appearances. Alexander smiled at me, and I could see pride in his eyes, not just for what I'd accomplished professionally, but for how I'd handled this difficult conversation, and I added, looking directly at Charlotte, it means building relationships based on who we actually are, not who we think we should be. Charlotte nodded, her face serious. I want to learn how to do that. I want to be someone worth knowing, not just someone who looks good in photos. For the first time in my life, my family was having a real conversation about real problems. It was uncomfortable and painful, but it was also honest in a way we'd never managed before. And sitting next to Alexander, I felt strong enough to navigate whatever came next. The following morning, I woke up in Alexander's penthouse feeling emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. The previous evening had been more intense than either of us had anticipated. But it had also been cathartic in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, my family had seen me clearly, not through the filter of their assumptions and disappointments, but as I actually was. Alexander was already up, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with his coffee and his phone, conducting what sounded like a conference call with international partners. He caught my eye and smiled, mouthing good morning before returning to his discussion of quarterly projections and market expansion strategies. I made my own coffee and settled into the comfortable chair where I like to read the morning news. But my attention kept drifting to the events of the night before. Marcus's financial troubles, Charlotte's admission of vulnerability, my parents' acknowledgement of their failures. It felt like we'd finally had conversations that were decades overdue. When Alexander finished his call, he joined me with a serious expression that suggested he'd been thinking about more than just business. How are you feeling about last night? He asked, settling onto the couch beside me. Exhausted, I admitted. But also relieved. I've been carrying around resentment for so long that I'd forgotten how much energy it takes to maintain. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. Your family dynamics are complex, but I think there's hope for real change, especially with Charlotte. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes felt genuine. You noticed that too? I was grateful for his perspective. Sometimes an outside observer could see things more clearly than someone embedded in old patterns. I notice a lot of things, Alexander said, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. What do you mean? He was quiet for a moment, then got up and retrieved his laptop from the kitchen counter. Emma, I need to share something with you. After we started getting serious, I had my security team do some background research on your family. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of research? Standard due diligence, he said quickly, seeing my expression. When you're in my position, You have to be careful about who has access to your personal life. I've learned that lesson the hard way. He was referring to his previous marriage. When his ex-wife had used their relationship to gain access to confidential business information and social connections that she'd later exploited for her own gain. What did you find? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Alexander opened his laptop and pulled up a folder of documents. Nothing alarming about you, obviously. Your background check was exactly what I expected. Stellar academic record, impeccable professional reputation, clean financial history. He paused, and I sensed there was more coming. But Marcus's financial situation is worse than he admitted. Last night, much worse. Alexander turned the laptop screen toward me, showing what appeared to be a detailed financial report. I could see bank statements, investment records, and credit reports, all bearing Marcus's name. How did you get this? I asked, though as a forensic accountant, I had some idea of what resources were available to people with Alexander's connections. My security team includes former FBI financial crimes investigators. He explained, when someone is about to become part of my family, I need to understand any potential liabilities or complications. I studied the documents, my professional training helping me parse the numbers quickly. What I saw was devastating. He's not just facing foreclosure, I said, recognizing the patterns. He's leveraged everything: the house, his retirement accounts, even Charlotte's jewelry, and these investment losses total about $800,000, Alexander confirmed. He borrowed against the house to make increasingly desperate trades, trying to recover his initial losses. The scope of Marcus's financial disaster was staggering. He hadn't just made bad investments, he'd compounded them with borrowed money, creating a spiral of debt that would be nearly impossible to escape. Does Charlotte know how bad it really is? I asked, based on her behavior last night. I don't think so. I think she knows they're in trouble, but not the full extent. Alexander pulled up another document. There's more. Marcus has been in contact with bankruptcy attorneys for the past 3 months. He's also been meeting with divorce lawyers. This explained the phone call Marcus had taken during dinner, and his increasingly erratic behavior throughout the evening. He's planning to leave Charlotte. It looks like he's exploring his options in Illinois. Filing for divorce before declaring bankruptcy could protect some assets from creditors. He might be calculating whether he's better off financially without Charlotte. The cruelty of this strategy was breathtaking. Marcus wasn't just facing financial ruin. He was potentially planning to abandon Charlotte right when she'd be most vulnerable. There's one more thing, Alexander said, his voice gentle. The timeline suggests that Marcus's financial problems started before Charlotte's spending increased. She didn't cause this situation, even though she may blame herself. This detail mattered more than Alexander might have realized. Charlotte had clearly been carrying guilt about their financial problems, assuming that her lifestyle expectations had pressured Marcus into bad decisions. But if his investment losses preceded her spending, then her self-blame was misplaced. What are you thinking? Alexander asked, studying my face. I was thinking about family loyalty, about the complicated dynamics of money and marriage, about the difference between consequences and cruelty. Marcus had made terrible financial decisions, but Charlotte didn't deserve to be blindsided by divorce proceedings designed to leave her with nothing. I'm thinking that Charlotte needs to know the truth, I said. She can't make good decisions about her future if she doesn't understand what she's actually facing. Alexander nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. The question is how to tell her without revealing that we've been investigating her husband's finances. This was delicate territory. Charlotte needed the information, but she also needed to preserve what remained of her dignity and her marriage. If that was what she chose, what if Marcus voluntarily disclosed everything? I suggested. If he's been carrying this burden alone, maybe he'd be relieved to finally tell the whole truth. That's possible, Alexander agreed. Especially if he understands that we're not judging him, just offering support. I thought about Marcus's reaction to Alexander the night before, the initial panic, followed by something that might have been hope when Alexander had offered practical advice about financial recovery. He was defensive because he was ashamed, I realized, but when you talked about bankruptcy as a legitimate strategy rather than a moral failure, he seemed to relax slightly. Alexander smiled. You noticed that too. Marcus isn't a bad person. He's someone who made mistakes and then compounded them by trying to handle everything alone. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the implications of what we'd learned. Then Alexander asked the question I'd been avoiding. What do you want to do about this information? It was a test of sorts. Would I use this knowledge to protect myself and Alexander from potential family drama? Or would I find a way to help Charlotte despite our complicated history? I want to help, I said without hesitation. Charlotte and I have our issues, but she doesn't deserve to be financially abandoned by someone she trusted. Alexander reached over and took my hand. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. It's one of the things I love most about you. You lead with compassion, even when it's complicated. So what's our next step? We invite Marcus to lunch, Alexander said. Just the two of us. No pressure, no family dynamics. I tell him that I understand financial stress because I've been there myself. And then we see if he's ready to ask for help. The plan was simple but potentially effective. Marcus needed to feel like he had allies rather than judges. And Alexander's business experience made him uniquely qualified to offer both practical advice and emotional support. And if he won't open up, Alexander's expression grew more serious. Then we find a way to protect Charlotte without violating Marcus's privacy. But I think he wants to tell someone the truth. Last night, when I offered perspective on bankruptcy, he looked like a drowning man who'd just been thrown a life preserver. I felt a surge of gratitude for Alexander's thoughtfulness and strategic thinking. He could have simply noted the potential family complications and suggested we distance ourselves from the drama. Instead, he was looking for ways to help heal relationships and protect people who mattered to me. When do you want to reach out to Marcus? I asked. Today, Alexander said. The longer he carries this alone, the more desperate his decisions might become. And Charlotte deserves to know what she's facing before he makes any irreversible choices. Alexander's lunch with Marcus took place 3 days later at a quiet restaurant downtown. Away from family scrutiny and social pressures, I spent those 3 days trying to focus on work while wondering how the conversation would go, whether Marcus would be receptive to help or too proud to accept it. When Alexander returned to his office that afternoon, his expression told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. He broke down completely, Alexander said, settling into the chair across from his desk where I'd been waiting. The moment I told him I understood financial pressure, he just collapsed. Started crying right there in the restaurant. I felt my heart break a little for Marcus. Despite everything, the shame and isolation he'd been carrying must have been overwhelming. What did he tell you? Everything, the whole story, start to finish. It's worse than our research indicated, but also more understandable. Alexander pulled out his phone and showed me notes he'd taken during their conversation. Marcus inherited some money when his grandfather died 2 years ago. About $200,000. He was supposed to invest it conservatively for their future. But he got caught up in cryptocurrency speculation and lost it all within 6 months. This explained the timeline we'd puzzled over. Marcus's financial problems had started with a single, devastating mistake that he'd then tried desperately to recover from. Instead of telling Charlotte what happened, he borrowed against their house to try to win back the inheritance money, but he kept making increasingly risky bets, each one designed to recover the previous losses. It was a classic pattern I'd seen in forensic accounting cases, the gambler's fallacy, where each loss feels like it increases the odds of the next bet paying off. The final blow came 6 months ago, Alexander continued. Marcus put their remaining home equity into a startup investment that his cousin recommended. The company folded within 3 months. So Charlotte's spending didn't cause any of this, none of it. In fact, Marcus said Charlotte had actually been trying to cut back on expenses over the past year because she sensed something was wrong. But she didn't know how to ask about their finances without seeming like she was questioning his competence. The tragedy of their situation was becoming clear to people who loved each other but couldn't communicate about the crisis that was destroying their life together. What about the divorce lawyers? I asked. Alexander's expression grew grim. Marcus consulted them because he was convinced that Charlotte would leave him when she found out the truth. He thought filing for divorce first might at least protect her from some of the debt. It was a twisted kind of love, destroying their marriage to save Charlotte from the financial consequences of his mistakes. Did you explain that there might The other options, I did. Marcus had no idea that bankruptcy could actually protect their primary residence in Illinois, or that there are programs for people with sudden financial hardship. He'd been so panicked that he hadn't researched his actual options. This was exactly the kind of situation where having resources and connections made all the difference. Alexander could provide access to financial advisors, bankruptcy attorneys, and debt restructuring specialists that Marcus would never have known to contact. More importantly, Alexander continued, I convinced him that Charlotte deserves to know the truth and be part of finding solutions. Keeping her in the dark isn't protecting her, it's preventing her from making informed decisions about their future. How did he react to that? Initially terrified, but then relieved. I think he's been wanting to tell her everything but didn't know how to start the conversation. Alexander leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. We agreed that he'll talk to Charlotte this weekend. Full disclosure, no more secrets, and then if they want help, I can connect them with people who specialize in financial recovery. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Marcus was finally ready to be honest, anxiety about how Charlotte would handle the news, and gratitude that Alexander was willing to help despite having no obligation to do so. There's something else, Alexander said. Marcus asked me to thank you specifically. He said you were the only person in your family who ever treated him like he belonged, rather than like an accessory to Charlotte's life. This surprised me. I'd always assumed Marcus was comfortable with the family dynamics, since they generally worked in his favor. He noticed that you were the one who organized family events, sent birthday cards, remembered anniversaries. He said, Charlotte got the credit, but you did the work, and he always appreciated that. It was strange to learn that someone had been paying attention to my contributions all along, even when I'd felt invisible. The weekend arrived with unusual tension. Charlotte had called Friday night to say that she and Marcus needed to talk to the family about something important. And could we all meet for Sunday dinner? Her voice had sounded strained but determined. Sunday evening found us gathered again in my parents' dining room. But the atmosphere was completely different from Mom's birthday celebration. Charlotte and Marcus sat close together, their hands intertwined, both looking nervous but resolute. Thank you all for coming, Charlotte began, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of what she was about to say. Marcus and I have something to tell you, and it's not easy news. Mom and Dad exchanged worried glances, probably fearing anything from divorce to serious illness. We're in financial trouble, Marcus said, taking over the explanation. Serious trouble. I made some very bad investment decisions, and we're facing foreclosure on our house. The silence that followed was heavy with shock and concern. Dad leaned forward, his business instincts engaging immediately. How serious? He asked. We're going to lose everything, Charlotte said, her voice breaking slightly. The house, our savings. Everything we've built together. And it's not because we were living beyond our means. It's because I made terrible choices with money that wasn't mine to risk. Marcus's willingness to take full responsibility was both admirable and heartbreaking. Charlotte squeezed his hand, supportively. But we're not giving up, Charlotte continued, finding strength in her voice. We're going to file for bankruptcy, try to save what we can, and start over, together. Mom was crying quietly, and Dad looked like he was calculating numbers in his head, trying to understand the scope of the problem. Is there anything we can do to help? Mom asked. Actually, yes, Charlotte said, glancing at me. Emma and Alexander have already been incredibly supportive. Alexander connected us with a bankruptcy attorney who specializes in cases like ours, and he's helping us understand our options. I felt a surge of pride in both Charlotte's courage and Alexander's generosity. The biggest help you can give us is understanding, Marcus added. We're going to have to move into a smaller place, probably rent for a while. Charlotte might need to find work. Our lifestyle is going to change dramatically. Your family, Dad said simply. Lifestyle doesn't matter. What matters is that you're facing this together and asking for help when you need it. Charlotte looked at me with tears in her eyes. Emma, I owe you the biggest apology. For years, I've taken your help for granted while judging your choices. But watching how you and Alexander handled this situation, with such kindness and practical support, I realized how much I've had backwards. We're sisters, I said. That's what sisters do. But even as I said it, I knew something fundamental had shifted between us. For the first time, Charlotte was seeing me as someone capable of providing guidance and support, rather than someone who needed to be managed or corrected. Alexander spoke up from beside me. If I may, I think you're both handling an incredibly difficult situation with remarkable grace. Financial setbacks aren't moral failures, they're problems that can be solved with the right approach and support. The evening continued with practical conversations about bankruptcy procedures, budgeting strategies, and timeline for major changes, but underneath the logistics, something deeper was happening. My family was finally learning to have honest conversations about real problems. As we prepared to leave, Charlotte pulled me aside one more time. Emma, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but would you consider being my maid of honor when Marcus and I renew our vows? We want to do it right this time, small, honest. Focused on what actually matters, the request caught me completely off guard. Charlotte's original wedding had excluded me from the wedding party. Now she was asking me to be her most important supporter. Are you sure? I asked. I've never been more sure of anything, she said. You're the sister I want standing beside me when I make promises. I actually understand this. Time looking at Charlotte, vulnerable, honest, finally asking for help instead of demanding attention. I saw the sister I'd always hoped we could be to each other. I'd be honored, I said, and meant it completely. The bankruptcy proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. Within 6 weeks of Charlotte and Marcus's honest conversation with the family, they'd filed their paperwork and begun the process of liquidating assets to pay creditors. Watching Charlotte navigate this period was like witnessing someone learn to walk again after a major injury. Painful, humbling, but ultimately transformative. The house sold quickly, thankfully, for more than they owed on the mortgage. After paying off the home equity loans and covering legal fees, Charlotte and Marcus had enough left to put a security deposit on a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they'd never consider living in before. The difference between their old Lincoln Park townhouse and their new Rogers Park rental was stark. But Charlotte surprised everyone by embracing the change with unexpected grace. It's actually liberating, she told me one afternoon as we helped her pack boxes in what used to be her walk-in closet. I used to spend so much energy maintaining an image that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist without performing. She'd started the painful process of selling her designer clothes, jewelry, and handbags, items that had once defined her identity but now represented desperately needed cash. I watched her carefully fold a $3,000 dress she'd worn once to a charity gala, preparing it for consignment. Do you regret any of it? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Charlotte considered the question seriously. I regret the debt, obviously, and I regret not paying attention to our finances, but I don't regret learning who I actually am when everything else gets stripped away. The eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday morning, even though they'd already moved out voluntarily. Charlotte had shown it to me with a rueful smile rather than the shame I'd expected. Legal formality, she'd explained. But seeing it in writing was actually helpful. It made everything real in a way that all our conversations couldn't. The most dramatic change was Charlotte's decision to find work. She'd never held a job for more than a few months, and those positions had been more social than professional. But facing the reality of their reduced income, she'd approached the job search with the same determination she'd once applied to planning parties. I know I don't have traditional qualifications, she told the hiring manager at a nonprofit organization that coordinated charity events. But I do have experience organizing large-scale social functions, managing vendors, and working with donors. And I'm willing to start at the bottom and prove myself. The nonprofit had hired her as an events coordinator assistant at a salary that was less than she used to spend on monthly facials. But Charlotte threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised her colleagues and family alike.